for the better part of a decade. Rentvesting was the smartest sounding strategy in Australian property. The pitch was seductive. Don't tie yourself down. Rent the lifestyle you actually want. The inner city apartment, the beachside suburb, the place you could never afford to buy. Then quietly build wealth by owning an investment property somewhere cheaper, where the numbers stack up. Let the tenant help pay the mortgage. Let the tax office chip in through negative gearing. Let capital growth do the heavy lifting. Rent where you love. Own where it's affordable. On paper, it was elegant. And for years, it genuinely worked. But here's the uncomfortable truth almost nobody selling the strategy wants to sit with. Rentvesting was never really about the property. It was about the maths underneath it. And in 2026, that maths has quietly, almost silently, inverted. To understand why it's breaking, you have to understand why it worked in the first place. Rentvesting ran on 3 engines. The first was cheap debt. When you could borrow at 2 or 3%, an investment property yielding 4 or 5% in rent almost paid for itself. The second engine was negative gearing, the rule that lets you deduct the losses on an investment property against your wage income. So the tax office effectively refunds a big chunk of that loss at your marginal rate. And the third engine was the 50% capital gains tax discount. Hold the asset longer than a year, and you'd only ever pay tax on half your profit when you sold. Wrap all 3 together. Add a decade of relentless capital growth, and rentvesting looked less like a strategy and more like a cheat code. Here's the problem. Every one of those 3 engines is now sputtering at the same time. Let's take them one at a time, because the numbers tell the whole story. Start with the most basic number in all of property investing, the gap between what a property earns you and what it costs you to hold. Right now, the Reserve Bank's cash rate sits at 4.35% after 3 separate rate rises this year. Inflation is still stuck around 4%, and the major banks aren't penciling in cuts until 2027. That means a typical investor is borrowing at somewhere around 6.5%. Now look at what the property actually earns. Nationally, gross rental yields sit at about 3.6%. In Sydney, it's closer to 3%. Even if you chase yield, buy in a cheaper market, pick a higher yielding property, you might get to 4%. So sit with that for a second. You are paying 6.5% to earn 4%. On a $700,000 investment property, that's around $41,000 a year in interest against $28,000 in rent. You're bleeding roughly $13,000 a year before you've paid a single council rate, insurance premium, or property manager. That's not a rounding error. That's the engine running in reverse. A decade ago, cheap money hid this gap completely. Today, there's nowhere for it to hide, which brings us to the second engine, the one that used to soften that blow. Negative gearing. Historically, that $13,000 shortfall, plus all your other costs, added up to a paper loss of around $23,000 a year. And you could take that loss straight off your taxable income. For someone earning $150,000, that clawed back roughly $9,000 a year from the tax office. It didn't make the property profitable, but it made the pain bearable. From the 1st of July 2027, that changes. Under the tax reforms passed this year, if you buy an established residential property after budget night, the 12th of May 2026, you can no longer deduct those rental losses against your wage or salary. The losses don't vanish. They get quarantined, carried forward to offset future rental income or a future capital gain. But that annual refund against your pay packet, the thing that made negative gearing feel like a partnership with the tax office, is gone. For our example investor, that's the $9,000 a year evaporating. It pushes the real out-of-pocket cost from around $18,000 a year. to the full 27. That's a 50% jump in what it costs you to hold. And it lands squarely on the established, negatively geared property that most rentvestors actually buy. New builds are carved out and keep the old rules. But that's a much narrower and much more specific game than the one most people signed up for. Now the third engine, the reward at the end. The whole point of wearing years of holding costs was the promise of a big, lightly taxed capital gain when you finally sold. That's where the 50% discount did its work. From the 1st of July 2027, that discount is being replaced. Instead of automatically halving your gain, the new system indexes your cost base for inflation, then applies a minimum 30% tax on what's left. For small, short-term gains, it's roughly a wash. But for the large, long-run gains that rent vesting was actually built around, it bites. The government's own worked examples show an investor with a big gain paying tens of thousands of dollars more in tax under the new rules than under the old discount. The back-end payoff that justified all that front-end pain just got smaller. And here's the part that makes rent vesting specifically, not property in general, so exposed. Because rent vesting has two sides. You own on one side and you rent on the other. And both sides are squeezing at once. On the renting side, the cost of being a tenant is climbing at the fastest pace in years. Nationally, rents are up 5.7% over the past year. Over 5 years, they've risen nearly 43%. Australian renters are now handing over a record 33% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads, with the vacancy rate sitting near 1.5%. Less than half of what a balanced market looks like. So the rent where you love half of the equation, the part that was meant to be the cheap, flexible, lifestyle side, is getting more expensive every single year. Then look at the owning side, and where the growth has actually gone. The markets where rentvestors most want to eventually live, Sydney and Melbourne, are the exact markets now going backwards. Sydney values are falling month on month and sit below their late 2025 peak. Melbourne has barely moved in years. Meanwhile, the yield-friendly markets rentvestors bought into, like Perth, have already run more than 25% in a single year, which is a late cycle warning sign, not an invitation. Run the break even. Just to cover your after-tax holding costs at today's rates, you need capital growth of around 3% a year, every year, before you even count the cost of selling. And in the premium capitals, growth right now is negative. You're being asked to fund a guaranteed rising loss today in exchange for a capital gain that has gone missing in the very suburbs you were counting on. So let's reframe this properly. Because rent vesting is dying is a headline, not an argument. Property isn't dead. Australia's housing shortage is real and structural, and well-chosen property will still build wealth for plenty of people. The point is narrower and more important than that. Rent vesting was never a magic strategy. It was a leveraged bet on 4 specific tailwinds, all blowing in the same direction. Cheap debt, a generous deduction on the losses, a generous discount on the gains, and near guaranteed growth. For a decade, all 4 blew together. In 2026, for the first time, all 4 have turned at once. Rates are high, the wage deduction is going, the discount is shrinking, and the growth has vanished from the very suburbs the whole plan was pointed at. When every input in your model moves against you simultaneously, the honest response isn't to argue with the maths, it's to go back to what the numbers actually support. So what do you do with this? A few things. First, and this sounds obvious, but almost nobody does it, run your own numbers at today's interest rate. Not the rate from 2021. Model it at 6.5%, not 3%. The strategy that worked then is a completely different animal now. Second, separate 3 numbers that usually get blurred together. The cash you have to physically fund each month. the true economic cost after tax, and the capital growth you're quietly relying on to bail the whole thing out. If that growth assumption is doing all the heavy lifting, you don't have an investment. You have a hope. Third, know exactly where you stand on the new rules. If you already held your property before budget night, you're grandfathered under the old system. If you're buying now, understand the sharp line between an established property and a new build. Because from July 2027, they're taxed in completely different worlds. And fourth, weigh the whole package honestly. Leverage, illiquidity, everything concentrated in a single asset in a single suburb. And now, a heavier tax load. For a lot of people, when you line that up against a simpler, lower cost, diversified way of building wealth, the boring option quietly wins. It usually does. That's kind of the whole point of this channel. The maths that built the rentvesting dream didn't get repealed by an economist or a headline. It got repealed by higher rates, a new tax act, and a rental market that's punishing the exact people the strategy relied on. None of this means never buy property. It means run the numbers with clear eyes at today's cost of money and make sure the strategy still holds up when the tailwinds turn into headwinds. Because a plan that only works when everything goes right was never really a plan. Everything in this video is general information only. It doesn't take your personal circumstances into account. So before you make any move, get advice that's tailored to you. And if this helped you see the numbers a little more clearly, subscribe, because around here, we'd always rather be boring and right than exciting and broke.